Hello and welcome to another episode of the Misinformation Podcast. I'm Z, aka The Reluctant Accountant, and as always, I am delighted to be here. So in today's episode, I'm going to talk about housing, or rather the housing crisis in the UK. And there's a real reason that I'm going to do this, because I find that sometimes the narrative around housing is very much distorted. The reasons that we have this kind of housing shortage are kind of referred to in passing, but people don't always know the details of what happened and why it happened in the way that it did. We kind of hear these kind of sound bites of things that happen. And also there's always the age-old thing of just just blame the immigrants. So I want to talk about that, and I want to tell you a story about why this is, I wouldn't say it's like the overriding important thing to me, but it's something that kind of hits close to my heart because it's something that I have personal experience with, and I think most people do. I think in this country, most people have had, a lot of people, if not most people, have had really difficult experiences with housing, especially in today's market. It's so difficult to be able to just rent a property, far less for buying one. So I want to take you back first when I start telling this story, and I want to take you back to 2009, because in 2009, I went to live in Paris for a year. We'll not get into why, we'll get into that another time, but I went to live in Paris for a year, and so I lived there from 2009 to 2010. And one of the things that was really shocking to myself, and indeed my daughter, I remember her commenting on this, were the number of people that were living on the streets. And I remember her saying, why do all these people sleep on the streets here? And it was something that in her, 4 or 5 year old, however old she was at the time, her young brain, she was like, she'd never seen that before. And she'd grown up in London, but she'd never seen people just kind of lying on the streets at the time. And I remember being quite shocked about it, especially seeing little kids living on the streets, in these tents and stuff. It was just really something I hadn't seen in the UK. And I remember speaking to French people, and they were just kind of like, oh, well, it's, they don't have papers. And I was like, oh. And I genuinely don't think that in France, they just had more immigrants than we had immigrants. I don't think that was the case. But at some point during that period, we had some sort of handle on the people that were living on the streets, or not living on the streets rather. And I say that as someone that grew up knowing about Cardboard City under, the Waterloo underpass. So if you don't know what Cardboard City is, I'm probably showing my age, but I remember this being a place where it was called Cardboard City because there were loads of people that lived in, for want of a better word, cardboards, under the tunnels between, Waterloo and the South Bank. There were loads of people living there. And then it wasn't there. At one point I just realized, oh, Cardboard City's not there anymore. So now I go out in the streets and I see, and it isn't necessarily kind of the same as what I experienced in France in terms of the demographic of the people that are living on the streets. But in many ways, again, this argument of just it being kind of people that don't have papers is not true, because there seem to be a diverse range of people that are living on the streets in the UK. And it's one of those things that you're either forced to confront or and just be horrified for, or you normalize it. And I don't feel comfortable with normalizing that as part of the fabric of the society that we want to live in. I don't really feel comfortable as this just being, that's just what happens. And so I think housing is something that it is a right. I don't think it should be a privilege. I think everybody has the right to safe housing, but it's not a right that's afforded to everybody, unfortunately. And I think that we're all much closer to being those people, unfortunately, that are houseless or homeless and living on the streets than we kind of sometimes realize. And so, as I said, I'm not going to kind of deal with this whole immigration and housing thing. If you want me to do that, maybe get in touch with me and I'll speak about that in a separate episode. I want to just speak about the kind of housing crisis in the UK and when did this start? Because the fact is that we didn't always have a housing crisis in the UK. In fact, we used to have a lot of housing in the United Kingdom. And there used to be a lot of social housing that was provided by local authorities and housing associations. So in 1979, for example, there were like 5.5 million social houses that were provided by the local authority and by housing associations. And despite the growth in the population, by 2021, that figure had fallen to 4 million. Fallen. And I say despite the growth in population, and people may go, I told you immigration. But again, you know, the free movement of people, when this happened in 1979, we were in the European Union at that point. So there was always going to be a movement of people. And so really, how did we get here? Which I think is a very good question. I think it's a very good question because if you don't understand how you got to someplace, you're not going to really know how to find your way out of it. Now, before I get to it, before I kind of get into kind of the meat and bones of it, I want to tell you this story about a conversation that I had with somebody. This is years ago. It was kind of over 15 years ago or something. And I had this conversation with somebody because I was living with my children on the Aylesbury estate with my grandmother. Because despite this narrative that like, oh, you just have kids and you get this house and it's just very, very easy. I don't know. Maybe I just missed the boat on that, but I never got a property and I was renting privately a lot, but it's a very kind of unstable existence to have because the landlord would like raise his rents and whatever, and you're constantly having to move. So in the end, I went to live with my grandmother for a while, as I said, on the Aylesbury estate. Now, if you don't know what the Aylesbury estate is, when my grandmother moved in, it was brand new. And when she moved in, it was brand new. She'd hung her washing out on the balcony and someone came and knocked on the door and was like, we don't do that on the Aylesbury. The funny thing about that, if you don't know, again, so it sounds like, oh, that's a really nice place to be. Aylesbury was also the filming location for example, Top Boy Summer House. So if it once had a prestige, it certainly didn't have that into the kind of era that I was living there. Which is fine. Like it was a place I was familiar with. As I said, my grandmother moved in the 70s when it was really new. And I'd been to the Aylesbury a lot. So like I was living there and I kind of felt like it was familiar. You know, it was like a home from home because I grew up going to see my grandmother there. And so I'm living with my grandmother, trying to like figure out how to live, you know, with a London wage, which is not very much, even though it's higher than other places in the country, you know, raise kids and do whatever. And I remember having this conversation with this man, and he was just like, well, I actually resent that I am paying taxes so that you can freeload at your grandmother's house. And I was like, what are you talking about? And she was like, he was like, well, it's a council property. And I was like, well, you're paying taxes? I pay taxes too, because I've got a job. He didn't really want to hear that argument, but the argument in itself was just really ridiculous. So he was saying that because council rents are lower than market rents, then he was somehow subsidizing me to live with my grandmother. Now, first of all, the council owned the stock of housing that they had. They owned it. So whether they want to charge £1 or whether they want to charge £50, like whatever it is, that's nothing to do with him. Let's just kind of start there. If I have a car and I own that car, if I want to rent it to someone for £5, that's my business. That has nothing to do with him. I haven't asked him to say, you know, pay the rest of whatever, go up to market rate. Like the whole idea was just absurd. But actually, the truth was that people like my grandmother that had been renting, specifically, you know, since the 70s, paying her rent in this council property, actually her rents had subsidized the discounts that were enjoyed by some other homeowners when they bought their property. So I'll explain. Everybody knows about the right to buy. And if you don't, I'll run through it very, very quickly. Now, during the reign, or some might call it a tyranny, of Margaret Thatcher, this was like her big political policy, right? This right to buy. And what it was that she was pushing through this big policy, this big push to have people that owned council properties buy their property. And I say it was a policy that she pushed through because it was actually something that existed already. Quite contrary to what people believe and what the right-wing media has pushed it forward as, because they see it as like something that's really a success. This wasn't a Thatcher idea. It wasn't like some stroke of genius from her. It was actually part of 19th century housing legislation. So that legislation required that council-built dwellings in redevelopment areas should be sold off within 10 years. So to kind of give you the example, in the early 1900s, for example, before the 70s, council houses were being sold off in a kind of right to buy scheme, if you like. But it was just happening on a much smaller scale. But what was also happening were specifically Labour municipalities were buying up at points whole streets of like squalid houses from slumlords. They were doing them up and then they were renting them out as social housing. And they did this for decades up into the 70s. So because of this, by the time the Tories came to power in 1979, the UK was in this enviable position of actually having a surplus of housing. And this was largely due to the kind of buying up of houses and doing them up and then renting them out. But as I said, one of the key pledges within their manifesto, within this Tory manifesto, was this whole idea of right to buy. And it was very much positioned as though this was like a Tory idea. This was something new that we're going to kind of push forward and push as a prominent political agenda. So much so that in the manifesto, apparently it took up as much space as, education and other things, just the right to buy, not necessarily other things to do with housing, but about the right to buy. It was taking up such prominence in the manifesto. And in 1980, once they were elected, Thatcher herself came on TV and she basically said, if you have been a council tenant for at least 3 years, you will have the right by law to buy your house. And that's that. I probably sounded a little bit more like the Queen, but you get the picture. I'm trying to create an atmosphere for you, so just roll with it. And so the thing about right to buy is that it's espoused as this like great egalitarian feat, right? It was this, people kind of have these cliches of like, oh, the Englishman's home is his castle, and how this is a great exercise in helping people to kind of climb the economic ladder, helping them to become homeowners. And I'm not going to deny that it didn't provide some people with the opportunity to become homeowners. It clearly did. But which people? So there was this study that took place, and it was a politically neutral study that was carried out. I think it was carried out between 1985 and 86, and it was published in 88. And they looked back at the first 5 years of right to buy. And what they said was that the purchasers were a diverse group, but they were clearly not representative of your average council tenant. They were disproportionately of middle age. They were disproportionately the better off. Many of them had adult sharing children who also were earning a wage. Most were in full-time work. They were very highly skilled manual workers, or they were in white collar jobs, and most had more than one wage earner in the household. And so those people that bought their houses, more than often than not, had more than double the income of those people that just continue to rent. So what does that mean? Well, the majority of council tenants had this right to buy in theory, but in practice, that right wasn't readily available to all of them. So those that didn't buy tended to be younger tenants. They tended to be lone parents, people living on their own, the unemployed, people working in lower skilled jobs. And also these people tended to have like a psychological barrier. And this was something that was brought out in the study. So they would be people that were like really scared of getting into debt. They didn't really understand about how mortgages worked and thought about that huge debt, and they didn't want to get into it. There were people that were afraid of like, I don't know how to deal with the repairs. How would I pay for the repairs of the property? There were people that just also didn't feel that they were homeowners. They didn't feel that was like something that was kind of above their station, where people like them didn't buy homes. And this shows how entrenched these ideas and this class ideology is in the psyche of British people. So what actually happened was the more affluent council tenants were able to benefit from this scheme and get these significant discounts to buy their council properties. And these discounts range from like 33% to 55%. But actually what was proven was that the average discount that people were getting was like 44%. So nearly 50% on the purchases of these properties. And so then what happened? Well, the rents for the remaining council tenants, they rose with a quickness. By 1991, they were 55% higher relative to average earnings than they had been 10 years earlier. So if that's not clear to you, let me spell it out. People like my grandmother and other council tenants that didn't purchase their homes, that remained in their council properties and continue to pay rent, they actually subsidised the discounts enjoyed by the more well-off tenants who did buy their property. So historians Colin Jones and Alan Murray wrote a book about this in 2006 called Right to Buy. And in the book, they conclude, if it were not for the right to buy, the council housing sector as a whole would have generated huge surpluses from rental income, and the rise in real rents would not have been necessary. So to put it directly, homeownership was made possible for wealthier council tenants through discounts paid for by the poorer neighbours. So this isn't meant to be an issue about, because I know people get really touchy about this. This isn't meant to be an issue about like crapping on right to buy. I understand that some people manage to get their properties and good for them. It isn't, I'm not even necessarily inherently against the scheme, because as I said, whilst the Tories kind of waved this flag and said it was this great idea of Thatcher's, the actual law existed and it predated the Tories kind of taking power and promoting it. I think what they managed to do, if there was any genius, it wasn't in coming up with the scheme, it was in manipulating it to kind of promote their ideology. Because I don't for one second believe that they thought, oh, this is going to be some great social equalizer. I don't believe that they thought, oh, this is going to help really a lot, you know, really help the country, if you like, with social mobility. What I think they did is what they always do, is they wanted to reduce the state. And so they saw this as a means of reducing the state by offloading what they possibly saw as a problem or having too much support via this social housing mechanism for the citizens of the UK. And this is evident from the fact that money raised from the sale of these properties wasn't kind of put directly back into replenishing stock or anything like that. Most of it went directly to the Treasury. So inevitably what happened as a result of you selling off something and not replace it is that the housing stock diminished over this period, despite the population growing. And one way you can see this is that former right to buy properties now make up 40% of all available private rented properties in England. And that figure is 71% in Milton Keynes. So 71% of privately rented properties in Milton Keynes were formerly council properties that were purchased through the right to buy scheme. Now, we hear about right to buy a lot, and it definitely had a huge impact on the situation with housing in this country. Another thing that people don't speak about as much, and I know this is going to get a lot of hate, but I'm going to say it anyway, is the introduction of buy-to-let mortgages in 1996. These buy-to-let mortgages significantly reduced the barriers that existed for average individuals to become landlords. And again, I know there are loads of people out here that maybe aspire to have property and become these landlords or whatever. I think with that, because I genuinely believe that housing and safe housing is a right, there comes with it responsibility. There comes with it, if you're going to be a landlord, it comes with a certain responsibility that you are providing housing, you are providing shelter to people or to a family. And so you have a duty to make sure that housing is safe, to make sure it's secure. If you want to be a landlord, you can't just take half of it, or it's not about just renting something out in any old condition and just shrugging your shoulders, or, you know, doing what I experienced in France was like, oh, well, they don't have papers. Oh, well, they're too poor to buy their own property. No, I think there is a responsibility that comes with it. And unfortunately, there are quite a few, I'm not saying all, but there are quite a few landlords that don't take that responsibility seriously. And they just see this as a way to make a quick buck. So they just see it as a way to kind of, oh, I'm securing this asset for myself. I can squeeze as much money as I can and income as I can, not thinking about the livelihood and the person and the impact of that's having on the person that is trying to rent that property. So what are the causes of today's modern day housing crisis that we have? Well, you've had, as I said, decades of inappropriately low levels of house building by the government, which makes it extremely difficult today to access social housing. We have a growing population. We have land banking, huge land banking by developers, and a lot of new private landlords entering the market. And so basically you have this perfect storm. And perhaps you knew these stories, right? Certainly, I think most people knew about or know about the right to buy. But the impact this policy and these other factors have had on our housing sector 40 years later have been devastating. And that, coupled with the tendency we have to demonize the poor and blame them for their own plight, overlooks the fact that it was those poorer folk who shouldered the burden of this Thatcher era policy through their payment of increased rents. And so the irony that this policy, which was kind of definitely shrouded or dressed up to be this great policy, was going to be this great equalizer that provides more autonomy to the citizens of the world through home ownership, and they have to rely less and less on the state. 40 years later, it's actually led to just that. Today, waiting lists run into millions. You have hundreds of people bidding on the same property, and the private sector is ridiculously expensive and woefully regulated so that people are living in awful conditions. The joke around affordable rents being distinctly unaffordable to the average citizen is one that's not lost on anybody. And we have a generation of people for whom the dream of home ownership is just that, a dream. Wow. That's it. That's all I've got time for today. And thank you for joining me again for another episode. It's been a good one, I think. I've gone through and covered many things. If you think there's something that I haven't covered, please feel free to reach out, comment, and don't forget to subscribe wherever you're listening to this. But please don't forget to leave a comment and let me know your opinion on what's going on with the housing. Do you think that there's more that can be done, and what do you think is the solution? If you'd like to get in touch, you can email me at themisinformationpodcast@gmail.com. That's themisinformationpodcast@gmail.com. That's miss with 2 S's. I'm on social media. I'm on TikTok. Sorry, I'm on TikTok at The Reluctant Accountant, and I'm also on Instagram under the same handle, The Reluctant Accountant. Thank you for joining me. Until next week, thank you and have a great week.